Hey there, I'm Molly, and you're listening to the It's All Connected podcast, where we talk about life, business, finances, travel, health, spirituality, and how it's all connected. This podcast is for you if you want real and relatable content that makes you feel like you're having coffee or drinks with a friend. You ready? Let's dive in. Hey there, and welcome to this podcast episode where I am going to be talking about how I'm turning 30 this year and how I'm feeling about it, lessons that I've learned in my 20s, and how I intend on going into my 30s. And the reason why I want to do this podcast episode today is because I feel like a lot of people are terrified of turning 30. And, I get it because it's a new decade of your life. You're probably thinking about who you've been, where you've been, and if you like the direction that you're going in. Maybe you want to make some career changes. Maybe you want to make some home family life changes. Maybe you're like, this is not the direction that I want to be going in. There are some changes I want to make. Or maybe you're like, this is exactly the direction I want to go in, and you're happy and you're also excited about going into your 30s. And I guess since I said also, now you know that. I feel pretty excited about going into my 30s because, to be completely transparent, my 20s were just kind of rough, kind of all over the place. Definitely learned a lot. So I am grateful for my 20s, but I don't think I would want to relive my 20s. And yes, I do get scared around birthdays. I'm not even going to lie. I get scared around birthdays because I always have to am I going in the right direction? What am I doing in my life? Have I accomplished enough? All of these things, all of these thoughts that come up, and I get a little weird around my birthdays. But for the most part, I am excited about going into my 30s because I feel like my 20s were kind of a test run, right? A trial run. And it was really a period of time where I got to discover who I am, discover, what I like, my dislikes, my values, my beliefs, um, the foundation of who I am. And now that I kind of have some of those things in place, I'm like, okay, in my 30s, I can expand that. I can work on that. And so I can build on that, right? Now that I have the foundation, I can build something with more intention, with more patience, with more of these things I wish that I had more of in my 20s. But I had to learn a lot of lessons in my 20s to get to the point where I am now. And sometimes I'm like, oh, am I a late bloomer? But even if I am, that's okay, right? We're all on our own timeline, we're all on our own journey. And a lesson that I've had to learn again and again is that comparison really is the deep joy. And if you're always comparing yourself, you're never going to feel satisfied or happy or complete because you're always going to be like, oh, why isn't my life like that? Or I could be doing that. And you're going to, just want to, your goalpost is always going to be moving. And I think for me, one of the things going into my 30s is I just want to have more patience. But before we get to that, the other reason why I wanted to create this podcast episode is because I want to be able to document it. So I'm turning 30 in less than 4 months. It's February right now. And so I think I'm going to launch this podcast in March. And so I guess by the time you listen to it, I'll be 30 in 3 months. And so I want to be able to listen to this podcast in a year, 2 years, maybe even 10 years. That would be pretty cool if I still had this podcast 10 years from now. But yeah, okay. So being able to listen back and see where my mind was at, and am I still going that same direction or have things changed? I don't know about you, but I get really excited by that. I think it's one of the reasons why I enjoy journaling so much is because I get to look back on my journals and it takes me back to that place, even where that place of where I wrote the journal entry, both physically and metaphorically, physically where I was at that time, and also metaphorically of where was I in my life and in my journey in terms of writing those thoughts down. And so, yeah, I think that that would be pretty cool to listen back on. And if you are currently in your 20s, maybe you're in your early 20s and you're just curious, or in your mid 20s, or maybe you're also turning 30 soon and you want to hear someone else's perspective on turning 30, then welcome. This podcast is for you. Or if you're already in your 30s and you're just curious about, my thoughts on it, then also welcome. Or like, whatever age you are, because they do say that age is just a number, right? Which I get, but also a topic for another day. Okay, so let's talk about some lessons that I've learned in my 20s. So the first one is patience. And I will admit that I am definitely impatient with some things, especially when it comes to my business and career and money and all of these things. I'm always like, I should have accomplished all of these things sooner. But then I think in the past few weeks, I don't know, something shifted. So I'm currently in Malaysia as I'm recording this, and I was previously in Taiwan for 3 months, and Taiwan was like a struggle. I was all over the place and not that patient. But then being in Malaysia, I feel like it's more grounding. And I've been going to a lot of like energy work, like breath work and healing classes. And that has helped me a lot with just patience. And I've also started working out, and I'm trying to do these things that remind me that day to day, it might not feel like a lot is happening, but then when you zoom out, you see so much happening. Like when I zoom out on my 20s, I'm like, oh, in my 20s, I was working at Whole Foods. I was probably working another job before Whole Foods, working like one or two other jobs before Whole Foods, and then I ended up at this like toxic job that I was at for less than a year, and I decided to leave because I was like, I can't spend the rest of my life like this. I can't even spend another year or like another month like this. And that was wow, that was a crazy time in my life. And then when I started my business, and then when I decided to end my relationship, and then when I went to go travel by myself for 6 months, that was my first solo trip. And, I ended up going back to the States, and then I moved out into my first apartment and signed a lease. And then I moved out of the apartment, and then I went to Mexico. Like all of these things happened within my 20s. And now I look back and I'm like, oh, so much has happened in my 20s, which makes me really excited for my 30s, because I'm like, how is that going to play out? Which I will talk about later. But yeah, like when you are in the day to day, you feel like not a lot is happening, especially if you live in the internet world where you have all of these pings of instant gratification and dopamine hits. And I'm definitely trying to work on that, of like having less of those dopamine hits, because they really affect me. And so that's the first lesson, just being more patient. My second lesson that I've learned is just letting go and moving on. And sometimes I feel like I've moved on, but then it like lingers back or creeps back up, because you have that lesson to learn, but in a different way. And so I've learned to let go of a lot of things. I've also learned that not everyone stays in your life, which used to make me really sad. But now I look at it more of I really appreciate these people for being in my life when they were. And, of course, I want people to stay in my life as long as possible, but also I'm not going to force it. If someone doesn't want to, then I'm just going to let them leave. And then if they want to come back in again, then the door is there, and then vice versa, right? Not everyone is going to stay in your life, and that's okay. Um, Something that my last therapist told me in one of our sessions was that people come into our lives, and I think I looked it up and it came from somewhere else, but I'm glad that she told this to me. People come into our lives for a reason, season, or lifetime. And I've definitely had a lot of people come into my life for a reason or a season, especially when I'm traveling, of course, because it's just hard to maintain those connections when you leave. I definitely try to, but then it doesn't always work out. But the reasons, like they really do teach you something. And so that was one of the lessons that I've learned in my 20s is to look back on the experiences I've had and ask myself, okay, what exactly did I learn from those? And how can I take that and, you know, apply it to the next situation so that I am a better person, so that I am a better friend, all of these things, right? And yeah, so that's the second lesson that I've learned in my 20s that I'm taking on to or into my 30s with. And then the third lesson that I've learned is change and also getting out of your comfort zone, which it's funny because I feel like people think that I like change or getting out of my comfort zone when it makes me very uncomfortable and it scares me and it makes me nervous. But at the same time, I don't want to stay in the same place. Like, I don't want to look back on my life and be like, oh, I didn't take that chance or take the opportunity or, I stayed the same because I was afraid. Yeah. And so I think that continuing to like push myself out of my comfort zone. And currently that looks like me going to the energy work classes and doing the healing work. And last year it looked like going to therapy because for the longest time I knew that I had things to work on, but then I wasn't working on them because I was scared that it would just like all blow up. And then, of course, it all blew up and then I had to face it. Right. And so, yeah. And then the fourth thing that I've learned is, well, it goes back to patience. The fourth thing is when you zoom out, you see how progress really happens and it's not linear. Like, my life hasn't been linear. I don't know if your life has been linear, but it's definitely progressed. I've had lessons here and there that all add up. And I guess that's kind of the first lesson then. Everything adds up, right? And I think that's also why I wanted to name this podcast It's All Connected, because I feel like everything that you've gone through in your life counts and it's all connected. And one area of your life impacts another area of your life. So if you're a business owner, how you show up in your business or like what happens in your business affects your family life or affects your friend life or affects all of these different things. And so being mindful of what's happening in your life so that you can make changes or you can be intentional about what you do. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, so that's the fourth thing. And then the fifth thing, I've learned a lot of lessons. The fifth thing that I've realized and learned, and a lot of people told me this, is that I am my biggest inner critic. And I feel like this has really manifested. I don't want to use that word with this necessarily, but like it really has played out in the past 2 or 3 years where a lot of self doubt has happened, a lot of like fear has happened, a lot of like me being like kind of negative and mean to myself has happened. And I can see how it has affected every area of my life. And so being aware now of like, what am I telling myself? What stories am I telling myself? What experiences are happening as a result of the beliefs and stories and thoughts that I am believing to be true? Because we can always tell ourselves a different story, right? We're always telling ourselves a story, but the question is, what story are you telling yourself right now? Are you telling yourself that, everything sucks? Are you telling yourself that everything is good? Like, you don't have to lie to yourself if you don't think everything is amazing. That doesn't have to be like what you tell yourself, but maybe the story is like, I am working on myself. I am working on becoming a better person, a better friend, a better business owner. I'm investing in myself. I'm investing time, energy, resources, etc. into myself. And so being aware of the stories and beliefs that you're telling yourself, being aware of how you treat yourself on a daily basis, even on an hourly basis. If you're like me, then you know that inner critic thought process. So those are some of the lessons that I've learned in my 20s. If you can relate to them, let me know. But I'm definitely taking those lessons for my 20s and then applying them into my 30s. So I want to talk a little bit about like how I am planning to do that. So recently I had a really amazing session with one of my friends. She did like an intuitive guidance and healing session for me. And the weeks following that, and then also just the energy work that I've been doing in Malaysia, I'm like, okay, I am going to be more patient with myself in my 30s. And I'm going to actually give myself the time that I say I'm going to give myself. And what I mean by that is in my early 20s, when I started my business, I told myself, okay, I'm going to give myself 3 to 5 years to let this come to fruition. Except every day I like freaked out about it. And it was so stressful every single day, every single hour, because I just felt like time was running out. And I remember someone once told me that I was only on a timeline because I gave myself a timeline. Hopefully that resonates with you too, or that like makes you have an aha moment, because that is so true. Like we are only on a timeline if we give ourselves a timeline. And so going into my 30s, I'm like, okay, these are things that I want to do. And I am not going to rush myself. I'm going to be patient with myself. I'm going to be kind with myself. And I'm going to give myself the time that I want and I need. And so in my 30s, I want to do things like I want to write books and I want to do this podcast. Like I was sitting here thinking about, I was like, what if I stopped doubting myself or stop like pausing the podcast? If you've listened to my past two podcasts, then you know what I'm talking about, where like I do a few podcast episodes and I stop and I come back and I stop. And then so I'm like, okay, what if I just stayed consistent with podcasts for a whole year, for 2 years? What if I still had this podcast 10 years from now? That would be absolutely amazing. And another thing that I want to do in my 30s is like host retreats, or maybe even start. I got scared saying this, but what if I created my own co-working, co-living space, the space that I would want, that I think that other people would want too, because we're all kind of connected, right? Like it's all connected. And I know that there are people out there who would want the space to be themselves, to express themselves, to do like both healing, creative, and growth work, right? Like growing as a person and also just like working on yourself in all aspects of your life. Um, and just like in general, helping people with improving their lives, which is something that I wanted to do a lot in my life. But to be honest, in the past 2 or 3 years, I've really struggled with that. And there was a point where I was like, I don't really know if I want to do that anymore. And as I'm doing this podcast episode right now, I'm like, actually, I do want to do that. But I was scared. I was scared that it wouldn't work out. I was scared that I was going to fail. And that kind of goes back to the theme of this podcast, right? Of why people are afraid of turning 30, is because maybe things have held them back, or they look back and they're like, oh, I didn't do that because I was afraid. But as you move forward, as life continues, you have new opportunities, new possibilities to make things happen, right? I'm actually going to do a podcast episode on, if you have like a lot of ideas, how to pick, like how to choose one and go with it and how to bring it to life. But another thing that I want to work on in my 30s is working on my confidence and self esteem, and just generally like how I view myself, what I say to myself, all of that, because I feel like that connects to everything else, right? That connects to how I show up on this podcast, that connects to like how I show up on Instagram, or at this point, like if I show up on Instagram, that connects to like my book writing, etc. And so hopefully you can see like how everything is all connected now. And then just journal, like being again more intentional, more patient, and just disciplined with myself, and looking at the long-term vision than wanting those instant gratification things, right? Because when I zoom out on my 20s, I'm like, oh, so much has happened. So what if this time in this decade, I go into it with more intention and I'm like, okay, these are the things that I'm working towards. And it's not that they can't change, but maybe don't change so much, right? Maybe I, again, give them more time to come to fruition. And yeah, it's just like crazy to think about how much could happen if you think about how much could happen if you gave yourself a full decade to work on yourself. Like, I've been exercising lately and I'm currently on my 11th day and I had a rest day in between. And I look at 11 days and I'm like, oh, 11 days, that's not that much. But then at the same time, I'm like, when was the last time I worked out 11 days? You know? And if I keep going with this, I could go on for 30 days. I could go on for 60 days. I can go on for like 90, 100 days. And this could be a lifelong habit that I build. And well, wouldn't that be worth it? And so I think about how that applies to this podcast. And if I do this podcast every week and eventually can bring on the guests and stuff like that too. And I think that would be really amazing. But yeah, so that's, I guess, in general, like how I feel about my 20s and how I feel about my 30s. I feel very excited. I feel like there's a lot of opportunities and possibilities. And it's really, like I've said a few times in this podcast episode, I've really struggled in the past 2 or 3 years. I think my late 20s, yeah, my late 20s were definitely a struggle, but I feel excited going into my 30s. And as I'm recording this podcast, I feel more excited. I feel a little scared, to be honest, because I'm like, oh, is anyone going to listen to this podcast? But that's also what I thought when I recorded my previous podcast episodes. And I used to be on a different like podcast platform and I would get these emails that I was still getting downloads even after I stopped my podcasts for months or even at that point a year. And I was like, wow, we're still listening to this podcast. So I am going to just again let go. That's one of my lessons for my 20s. Letting go, surrendering, and allowing what happens. Okay, that was a lot. So I think that's the end of it. But if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a DM on Instagram at Molly Hill Studio and let me know what you think. Are you in your 20s? Are you also in your late 20s and turning 30 soon and you were just curious? Or are you in your 30s or 40s, 50s, etc. Do you have any advice or wisdom that you'd like to share with me? Feel free to send me a message and let's talk about it. I am super curious to hear what you have to say. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast, the It's All Connected podcast, so that you can get notified of future podcast episodes. Yeah, with that, I will talk to you soon. Thank you so much for tuning in to this podcast episode. I hope that it helped or it was entertaining. Yeah, I'll talk to you in the next podcast episode. Bye.